Hi, welcome to the garage. I'm David Schoneman. Have you ever wondered about taking a pile of rusty, old, vintage motorcycle parts like this and making them into something like this? We're going to show you how. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the garage. We're continuing to build our vintage BMW 1000cc motorcycle out of parts we found here in the shop and parts that we've had to order. This is a project, and projects have different phases, and we're in a phase now where we're collecting parts to put into the first a rough assembly and then finally a complete final assembly of this vintage motorcycle. So we've been through the inventory stage, and we've now into the ordering parts stage, and now we're receiving parts. So I want to go over some of the things we've received recently this last week. We still have plenty more to order, but I want to show you the components that we're picking up, and then we'll see how they end up in the final assembly. So we received a package from Euro Moto Electrics. They are a company that sells a lot of BMW parts. Again, we don't get anything from mentioning their name. This is not a sponsorship deal. It's nothing like that at all. It's just this is a vendor that we've used. They have high quality BMW parts that in some cases are OEM parts, but they're not as expensive as going to a BMW dealer. In other cases, they're very high quality aftermarket parts that fit these machines. They know these machines, and that's very helpful so that we can call them up and talk to them and get expert advice. So we've received a few things. First, I want to show you this engine cover. We're going to change the profile. This is an aesthetic issue. This is the engine cover. It goes over the starter motor. The front of the bike would be this way. The back of the bike would be this way. The carbs are going to sit here. The cylinders will come out the side. And it changes the profile. So we're going for a little more elegant profile, a simpler profile on the engine. This is the side view, and this is what you'll see. The original cover, stock cover, kind of comes up like this and has a big hump back here where the air filter would be inside of a housing. We're going to dispense with that single air filter that feeds both carbs. We're going to go with either filter pods or velocity stacks. I'm not 100% sure. We'll see how that develops. But this is a high quality cast aluminum part that fits right on top of the engine and will change the profile. So it's an aesthetic contribution to the bike. We've received electronic ignition. This is an ignition system for the bike to replace the points and condensers and all that kind of thing that are on the motorcycle originally. This is going to sit on the front of the motor. Right on the front of the motor, we're going to have the alternator. And we may have spoken about the alternator before. We're going to use the stock alternator. It's not real high output. We can replace it with something much higher output, but it's got a cost associated with it, of course, and trying to keep the budget within limits. I found that out of all the alternator parts I have, we have parts that seem to be serviceable. They test out fine with a multimeter in terms of resistance, and I think we're going to get good electrical generation out of there, if not a lot, at least sufficient for the bike, and certainly at the same level that it was when it was new back in the 70s. But the electronic ignition will go on the front of the alternator. It attaches to the front of the alternator underneath the front engine cover, and this will help us with the spark. And again, we get rid of some of the parts that require a lot of tuning and constant maintenance. Points and condensers, they can go out of whack fairly easily, and this is going to simplify and give us a better spark so the engine runs better. A very high quality product. We've got Brembo rotors. Now these rotors, these are brake rotors, brake discs. They go on the front. We have 2 disc brakes on the front of this bike and a single drum on the rear. And the bike did not come with any rotors. It'd be nice if we had the rotors, but we don't. This is a Brembo rotor made for the BMW, and it's going to have 1 on each side. They're brand new, and you can see some of the machining marks in here that Brembo does a very fine job. Brembo brakes are very high quality, made in Italy, and this is going to go 1 on each side, and it will give us a stopping power. We're going to talk about the calipers later. In fact, some of the parts in here, we're looking for our caliper rebuild kits, and then we're going to segment after this one. After we go through these parts, we're going to take a look at rebuilding our calipers. So high quality Brembo rotors will have great stopping power. They're drilled for cooling. We have 2 of those, 1 on each side. These are great parts. Not ready to put them on yet, but as we begin accumulating things, we'll put them in the stack of parts to go together, and then they'll be ready and handy when the time comes. Got a couple of boxes of small parts here. Here's a rear brake light switch. There's a lot of parts in a bike. You know, in our earlier episodes, we talked about the basics: motor, transmission, frame, whatever. But there's a lot of small parts that make up the difference, and we're starting to accumulate those. Some, like I say, we have, some we don't. So we got manifolds here to put the carburetors on. We talked about carburetors last time. Those beautiful flat slide Mikuni carburetors are going to be held on to the engine with the rubber mount. We've got spline lube. This is important that when we put our clutch together. I showed you the clutch before, but we have to put it together on the motor, and we have to lubricate the splines as they go into the engine, into the transmission, into the clutch rather. So I want to use a special lubricant so that we're not having to take it apart to replace any worn parts because they weren't properly lubricated. Special lube. Here we've got a fuel valve. I talked about fuel valve on a previous episode when we were talking about the gas tank. This is the left side fuel valve, brand new, BMW part, and it's got a filter screen on it so that any debris in the tank won't make its way through the valve, down the hose, into the carburetor. We have a left and right fuel valve. We've got clamps to hold the transmission drive shaft boot, keep the dust out of it. We've got tank mounting hardware. We've got a stud for the engine that holds the transmission on. We've got bearings and bearing caps for the swing arm. The swing arm, we spoke about, we needed bearings, and so we have new bearings and new caps. Tank mounting hardware. We've got a coil mounting hardware, lots of parts. Another clamp for the boot. We've got 4 bolts that are used for connecting the drive shaft to the output side of the transmission. These are special bolts. They're one-time use only. They come with a little red thread sealant on there to help them stick better. We'll have to torque them to a certain specification, then loosen them up, then retorque them. They stretch a little bit. These are designed to stretch a little bit, and they're one-time use only. So whatever bolts were in there before would have been tossed. So these are one-time use. We have spacers for the center stand. We have more bolts and lock washers that are for the clutch. The clutch is held together in the back of the motor with a set of 6 bolts. These are those bolts. These are not one-time use to the best of my knowledge. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't have them, so we had to get them. And again, it's just with experience or by looking at the microfiche online that you can find that you even need these parts. Some more clamps for the carburetors, and we've got our other fuel valve. So that's one box of small parts. On here we have caliper rebuild kit. We'll use these later. And we've got a few other things in here. We have a tool. This is a special tool. Sometimes we can make tools, or we find that we have standard tools in the toolbox that we can use. And this is an alignment tool for the clutch. We put the clutch plate and the clutch mechanism together on the back of the motor. This will serve to align it. This piece will go into a bearing on the back of the flywheel, and this piece here, the section, will support the clutch disc because there can be some movement in there. We want it to all be lined up on the back of the motor so that when we slide the transmission on and those splines go into the clutch, everything is going to fit and be lined up. It's an important tool. You know, it's the kind of thing where you're going to use it once. And we talked about which transmission. We have the 81 and later transmission. This is for the 81 and later transmission. It's a different tool for the earlier transmission. So we're going to use it once on this project, but I suppose we could fumble around with it and not have to get a tool, but I think that it's good to have the right tools for the job that we're trying to do. So that's a tool for aligning the clutch. I've got some more manifolds for the carburetors. And actually, here are the bearings for the swing arm. The previous package I showed you, that was the dust cap. There's a bearing that goes in, and there's a dust cap that goes on over it. We'll get those pressed into place, and we'll have good swing arm bearings. So that's what we've received in this order. And there's a lot more to go. We haven't done anything electronically yet, aside from the electronic ignition. But we have to get some of the Moto Gadget equipment. We have to get a speedometer or a tachometer. That's all electronic. We have to get our switches squared away. So we haven't really done anything with the electrical system yet, aside from talk about the alternator and determine that we have a good alternator in our box of parts, along with this electronic ignition. So that's it for our unpackaging here. The next thing I want to show you when we come back in just a moment is the fork. We talked the last time in the last episode about the forks, and we rebuilt those forks. That was our first subassembly. And at the end, we put the spring in the fork tube, and I was putting the cap on, and we found that it was going to be hard to put the cap on, and I didn't want to do it while we were making the video. So I did it in the interim, and I can explain to you in a moment how we solved that problem. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to work on our second subassembly. The forks were our first subassembly, and our second subassembly is going to be to rebuild the two calipers. We'll talk about that too. The idea here is that just like having all these purchased parts now on the shelf ready to go when they're ready to be put into the bike or onto the bike, we'll have our subassemblies done. Brake calipers rebuilt, forks rebuilt, so that when it's time to go on, we can just put them on and we're not taking time out of the assembly process to do these subassemblies. Subassemblies are very important also in a project. So we'll be back in a moment. Okay, welcome back. We're ready to get to work on some parts here. I want to start with the forks. In the last episode, I spoke about the forks. We assembled the forks. We have not put oil into them yet, but we got the bolt in. We had to cement the cap in. Everything is looking good. We're not going to finish putting the cap down until the forks are in the frame because they have to go through, and this cap is in the way. They have to go through the triple, and this cap is in the way. So the cap has to come off for final assembly. We'll put the fork in, then once the fork is on the bike, we'll put the spring in and put the cap down. Now, last time I talked about how the spring sticks out a little bit and you have to push down on the cap to get it in. Not much leverage up here on the bench. It didn't work very well, so I just took it off the bench offline and did it on the floor, bent over and pushed the cap down against the spring with some body weight in behind it and turned the cap in, and I've started the threads. So both forks are complete for now, with the exception of oil. But we've got the plugs in the bottom. We have the fill port on the top, and they're clean and ready to go with new seals. And we'll put those in, and then we'll fill them with oil and put the cap on, part of the final assembly. I'll show you all that when the time comes. Put this aside for the moment. And for the rest of the time today, I want to take a look at the calipers. These are the brake calipers. I have two sets, or two calipers rather. This is one set of halves, and this is the other. And they go together like this with pistons inside and with seals. So I've had these apart now. I took them apart on a previous video, and now we're ready to put them back together. In the meantime, I've cleaned them. They weren't too bad. The piston sits inside the caliper half like this, and when the pistons came out, there was residue, some sludgy old brake fluid in here. Brake fluid should be, it's fairly thin. It's almost clear, a little bit of a yellow tint to it, generally. And you don't want any debris in there. But what can happen with time is that the fluid can absorb moisture, or if moisture gets in there, it'll work its way down to the bottom lowest point on the system, which for the front brakes, of course, is the caliper. The handbrake is up here on the right side. The lines go down to the caliper, and then the caliper itself is the low point, and water goes down to the low point. And there was some emulsified fluid in here, kind of sludgy. I took it apart, cleaned everything. There's also a fairly small passage on each half. This is the way they go together. Fluid comes in one of these ports, and the other one is the bleed port. But the fluid that goes into the caliper half has to transfer to the other caliper half, and then the pressure of that fluid has to make its way down to the back of the piston. So what I normally do is I take a piece, in this case, 41 thousandths safety wire. It's stainless steel wire, 41 thousandths in diameter. The hole is a little bit bigger than that, but I can stick it in here, and you're not going to see it all the way, but it comes out over here, and I'm able to clean this passage carefully. I cleaned it with some brake cleaner. I cleaned some of the sludge out with this little piece of wire, and then I made sure that it was clean up here too. So this passage connects to this port, which connects to this passage down here. Same on both halves. So before I put it together, I made sure that everything is clean. There's also a seal ring in here that I took out. We're going to replace that. That wasn't in very bad condition. I did not show that on camera last time, but it goes inside the caliper half, inside the cylinder here. And sometimes those are old and stiff. This is pretty soft still. So I think someone was in these calipers not too long ago. The brake pads, I may have said it last time, they were not very well worn, which would indicate that someone had replaced the pads. And maybe they replaced the pads and did a caliper rebuild at the same time. But rather than take that and use it, we've got the bike apart. We decided to rebuild the whole caliper. So the final step is I'm just going to spray a little bit of cleaner in here one last time. This is just brake cleaner down this passage. Just a little bit down this passage. I will take the fluid that made its way into the caliper half, just soak it up with a little bit of paper towel here, and then wipe these surfaces down one last time. We don't want any debris between these two halves because there's an O-ring here. It has to seal really well. I'm going to blow this out with pressure. I'll do the same on this half. Just a little shot of brake cleaner. I see it comes out inside the caliper half. It's a little damp in there. This is just brake cleaner. We'll wipe that up. This evaporates very, very quickly. We'll use the residue or the leftover bit on the towel here to just wipe down these mating surfaces. Then I'm going to blow some air through to dry it all out. Okay, nice and dry, and the passages are clear. Very important. We're going to all this trouble. We want to make sure that the brakes will work well when they're done. All right, we've got our two caliper rebuild kits. I'm going to open one of them. These are Brembo parts. I think that for some calipers, if you can get the OEM, manufacturer's OEM parts, I recommend doing it. If you can't, then I think there are some good aftermarket components out there. But in this case, we have the Brembo components. So if we have the Brembo components, we're going to use them. First, we have this little bag that has the two seals that go inside the caliper half. They've got a little bit of lubricant on them. This is not oil, by the way. We cannot use a petroleum product when we are putting a caliper together or working with brakes, because the brake fluid is not petroleum based. So we don't want to use a petroleum product. This kit comes with, I believe it does, here it is in the bottom, a little package of special silicone lubricant, which is specific for the caliper. So I'm going to just put these in. It should be able to go in here, no trouble. I put that one in. There's a groove inside the caliper half. Now, like I say, these are already lubricated. So I'm just making sure that the lubricant is evenly spaced around there, and it is. We're just going to insert this rubber seal and get it to sit properly in that groove, which it does. Now it will, if you run your finger around on the inside of the caliper half like this, I can feel the rubber seal sticking out from the sidewall, just a tiny little bit. And it's supposed to do that because we want to have a nice tight seal between the piston and the caliper half. And so that's what we have here. We got a nice tight seal. It sticks out a little bit, so rubber seal is going to be running on the edge of the piston as the piston moves in and out. The pistons don't move very far. They're just putting a little bit of pressure. And once the brakes are adjusted, and they're self-adjusting, disc brakes are self-adjusting. Once they're adjusted and the pads are very close to the caliper, we're going to find that the piston hardly moves at all. It just moves a tiny little bit to put a lot of pressure, actually, a lot of pressure onto that disc. But the movement, the distance that it travels, once everything is self-adjusted, is very small. So I'm opening up this envelope. It's this clear silicone lubricant in here. This will mix with the brake fluid, whereas a petroleum product won't, because they're not the same base. So this is not going to be a problem for our in mixing with our fluid. This will mix properly. We don't want to overdo it. I'm just putting a little bit on the cylinder wall. I'm going to put a little bit on the piston as well. The pistons were in great shape, by the way. They were, there was no pitting. You can replace pistons too, but we don't need to in this case because there was no pitting and no rust. Like I say, the water, there was water inside these caliper halves. So there was a little bit of surface rust on the pistons, not very much. I'll wipe a little excess off of there. I'm just going to gently insert this piston. Now there is that seal in there, and it does stick out a little bit, so there's going to be a little bit of resistance. But there, we can push it in, and now it's in. All right, we'll do the same with the other one. The seal is already in there. We'll use a little bit of this lubricant. And actually, we have another seal to put on here too, so I think I'll put this seal on the piston first before it goes in. There's a groove on the piston, the seal fits in there, and then this other groove fits into the caliper half. But with the piston already in there now on the other one, it might be a little more challenging to get it in there. But that's okay. I can take care of that. So some of the lubricant, we're going to put it onto the wall of the piston. I already did it on the cylinder wall. And these pistons aren't actually going to be, the brakes aren't going to be installed and ready for use for some time yet. We have a ways to go on this project. But it's nice to have the subassembly done so that when it's time to put them on, they're ready to go. I know they're in good shape, and they're ready to work. Now, this will be sitting for a little while. It'll be a few months at least, I'm expecting, before there's any fluid in these calipers, because we still have to get them mounted. We have to take care of all the things we have to do on the frame in terms of getting it sandblasted and whatnot in order to put it together. There we go. That goes in. Now I'm going to ease this rubber seal onto the little flange on the caliper half here. Okay, it's in there. I do not have brake pads, so we're not going to put brake pads on today. I'm going to try to get this one on here as well. I may have to put a little bit of air on this again just to get it to move a wee little bit. Let's see if there's any air left in the compressor. There we go. All right, the piston came out. I'm just going to put the seal on this one. I should have done it the first time around. But we'll put the seal on here. This is just a dust seal. The seal I put in before actually holds the fluid. This is just a dust seal. Ease that back in there. The piston is back in. And now I'm just going to put the dust seal onto the flange of the caliper half. Get a good dust seal all around. The pistons are in. Pistons are in and with a little bit of lubricant, so they're not going to seize up at all. And by the time we put it together, it'll be great. It'll be still operational, of course. It's not going to be a problem. Now, I do have one more O-ring here, one more seal. I talked about the two halves going together, and they do. They have to go together like this, and there has to be a seal so that when pressure is applied to one half and the fluid travels from one half of the caliper into the other half, there's no leakage. So we've got an O-ring around those two ports that I cleaned with that wire before. So this is a tiny little O-ring, comes in the kit. Just going to get a little bit of sealant on there. Not sealant, just a little bit of lubricant on there. Again, this lubricant is not going to be affected by the fluid. It's not going to interact badly with the fluid that's going to flow through here ultimately. So the O-ring is in place. The lubricant I put on there, it helps it to seat properly when I put them together, and it'll help it maneuver into position and make sure it lines up properly. And we've got new bolts. I mentioned too we were going to have new bolts with the caliper, and we do. They're going to go on this side, and I've got my wrench ready to go. So I'm going to put the two halves together, being careful to keep that O-ring in place. I can see that it is. I can feel that it is. Feel it kind of notch into position. Drop one bolt in. Drop another bolt in, and just begin tightening them down. It squeezes that O-ring into position between the two halves, so we get a good seal. Now, if we were just going to change the brake pads, we wouldn't be taking the caliper all the way apart. Now, we are going to put new brake pads in, but in this case, since we had the caliper off the bike, we decided to rebuild it. So there's one caliper half put together. Pistons are in place, and all we need to do is to drop new pads in. All right, let's do the second one. I start with a little bit of a spray down the passageway here. I can see it coming through into the caliper half. We're good there. I'm going to mop it up a little bit and then use that to just do one final clean on the surface, on the mating surfaces. I'm going to spray it out. It's nice and clean inside there. I'll run this wire down just to make sure. And I can see the tip of the wire come out the other end. No trouble. A little more air. That looks good. Let's check this half again as well. Wire goes down, no trouble. A little bit of fluid. Pick up the excess and wipe down the mating surfaces. And then a little bit of air. Okay, we're good. Got my second kit. Again, we want to make sure we use OEM kits if we can, and we have those. There are the dust seals, 2 new bolts, a tiny little O-ring right here, and the larger rings. And these come out of the package with a little bit of lubricant on them. I'll pop this into the groove. That's in there nicely. The key thing to doing these well is cleaning the parts properly. This was all crudted up with all kinds of stuff, and if we just give it a wipe down, then the parts they're not going to go together very well. Sometimes this groove that I'm putting this gasket into is loaded with old brake fluid that's been mixed with water, emulsified, and it's a mess. And the seal will not drop into that groove if the groove is not as clean as it was when it came out of the factory. And that's what you need. You want to get these things back to the condition they were in when they came out of the factory. Super clean and very easy for everything to go together. It's much better to do it right the first time than it is to try to rework it later. And that's how I feel about all these parts. If I can do it right the first time, when I put the bike together and ride it, there won't be any issues. That's our goal. All right, I'm just going to continue to use the packet of lubricant that I already opened up. There's way more in here than is needed for just one caliper. We could easily do 4 calipers or more, but I'll save the other packet in case I ever need to do a rebuild, and I don't have any. Some manufacturers do not include this. Many don't. Many just have just the parts. And you don't want to do it dry. You want to be able to put it together. And again, temptation can be to just put a little bit of oil on it, but you don't want to use any kind of petroleum product. Got my pistons over here. I'm going to put the seal on first. Just a dust seal fits into that groove. Again, the pistons are nice and clean. No pitting. So they are good to go. Try to keep your fingers clean when you're doing this too, because if you have dust and grime on your fingers, and it's sometimes hard to avoid, but if you have dust and grime on your fingers, that can create a gap between the piston and the piston wall. All right, so I'm going to drop this one into place. The seal is already in there. Lubricated and pushed in, it slips right in, no trouble. If you recall the difficulty we had taking them apart. Now we used air today and when we needed to, and of course we used air then too. These are hard to pull apart mechanically. You don't want to stick a screwdriver or anything in there because again, you're going to scratch it. All right, that one's together. Take our other piston, put the other dust cap on. And see, this is very straightforward, and you don't need to be mystified. If you're doing a bike project and you need to rebuild your calipers or you have them off, just rebuild them. The kits are not terribly expensive. So we get the kits, put it together, and then you know that that's one thing that's not going to be causing you any problems down the road. Same with those fork seals, like we talked about the other day. If you can replace a seal when you have the opportunity, it's going to be good for several years. Some of the seals you take apart on some of these old bikes, they could be original. And in this case, this is a mid-70s motorcycle. These aren't original, but they could have been. And if they are, the caliper can still come apart, it can still be cleaned, and it can still be reused. All right, we've got 2 pistons in, 2 dust seals, and it's nicely lubricated, not heavily, but nicely lubricated for the initial use. And once the fluid is in there, the fluid becomes its own lubricant. You don't need to lubricate them or grease them or do anything. You want to keep grease away from the caliper. So if you're greasing the wheel or whatnot, or the bearings. You don't want any excess grease to be flying around near the brakes. We're really trying to keep them clean of any kind of dirt and debris. This seal that I put on here, that keeps dirt and dust from getting into the between the piston wall and the cylinder wall. Make sure that's down nicely. And it is. I'm going to put our two caliper halves together. Up the O-ring moved to the other side. That's in place. If that O-ring is properly in place, the bolt lines right up, goes right in. And generally speaking, I'm going to tighten up the side that has the O-ring on it first. I'll torque all these down later to the proper spec. I just want to get it together with the O-ring in place so that the O-ring doesn't migrate. It has to stay where we want. All right, we've got the two halves together. These are a left and right, by the way. They're not identical. There is a left and a right. And we've got our two bleed screws. Now, I did clean the bleed screws. They're fine. No issues at all. This is a large diameter. Some of them are smaller, and they can sometimes even break off in here. I'm not going to tighten these down now, but they'll just thread right in here. Bleed screw goes on this side. Put a bleed screw on this one. These are all nice and clean. And I cleaned the seats inside too, so that when this is tightened down, we'll get a good seal. Then this motorcycle has hard lines. So this would typically thread in here, and this would connect to the brake line. Now I'm going to do these a little differently. I'm not anticipating reusing these. I think I'm going to have a brake line that will come from the handlebar and directly down to the caliper and eliminate an extra connection. Anytime you have an extra connection, there can be a leak. And these were designed for the master cylinder to be under the tank. And so the line had a route around the forks, and that's what this piece was for, to route the line around the forks to get it to where it could connect to the flexible line. I don't anticipate using those. All right, we got two calipers rebuilt. We've got the pins, which we'll put in when we have the brake pads. I'll probably be ordering those today. I'll drop the brake pads in later. We'll put those in, and we have a dust cap that goes over the top. And that's the completion of the caliper rebuild. Very simple. The issue on all of these rebuilds is cleaning. Taking it apart can be difficult. The most time-consuming piece, though, is cleaning everything before reassembly. Reassembly, if it's all clean, it's a piece of cake. And that's what we're going for. We're going for ease of reassembly. And then, of course, if we have to service the motorcycle later, if everything's been cleaned, it's very easy to take it apart. These calipers will have to be serviced at some point. It's down the road, but hopefully they'll come right out. I'm working on a bike over here. You can't see it in the picture, but the motorcycle sat outside for a long time, and it got a lot of corrosion between the bolts and the threads. And getting the front wheel off was very, very difficult because it was sitting outside and it hadn't been serviced for a long time. But now these have been serviced, and if we need to service them again, if we take care of the motorcycle in the interim, taking it apart and putting it back together later will be quite simple. So that's it for this segment. We'll be back in a moment. Okay, we're going to wrap up this episode, but before we do, I just want to go over one thing I neglected to say in the last segment when I was talking about the Brembo calipers. The caliper rebuild kits come with these instructions. They're in multiple languages. Brembo is an Italian company. Multiple languages, and there's pictures that show you how they go together. So if you are looking for a kit and you end up with a Brembo kit because you've got high quality Brembo calipers and you're not sure how they go together, you will find an instruction sheet in the package. It comes with every single package, and it explains how it goes. There are certain things that are intuitive, and you do it once, you know them, but if you haven't done it before, you'll find this to be very handy. So that is it for episode 6. We are well on our way to building this bike, and I hope that you're going to stick with us as we continue. The show is available on Channel 96 here in Nashville. I hope you're watching there. It's also available on YouTube. We've been hearing from some of our YouTube viewers, and I'm very glad to answer any questions that come in. Thanks for your support. I appreciate the encouragement. And we're also going out now on Roku. And you can find us by going to Access Nashua, which is the name of the local TV station here, public access television. Access Nashua, and once you're into their menu, you can find us down below. Plenty of other good shows to see there too. So if you like the show, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.